Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gil Eapen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gil@eapen.info. My guest today is Professor Michael Dickinson, who is Professor of Bioengineering and Aeronautics at the California Institute of Technology. One of his research focus areas is the flight of insects. Welcome, Michael.
It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. So I want to use one of your older papers to set the context, Death Valley, Drosophila, and the Devonian Toolkit. You say most experiments on the flight behavior of Drosophila have been performed within confined laboratory chambers, yet the natural history of these animals involves dispersal that takes place on a much larger spatial scale. And you have done a lot of experiments around this, going back a few decades, I think, right? You want to talk about one of the sort of the early experiments in this area?
Sure. Well, I mean, it'd be easy to actually talk about two bookends on that problem. The first bookend is what we were doing, beginning 30 years ago, which was to study the flight capacity of these little insects by creating, for the time, what were pretty sophisticated flight simulators. So this is a device where you take a fly, you carefully tether it, you glue it to a fine pin, and you place it within an apparatus where you can measure the motion of its wings and the forces and turning moments, the torques that it's generating, and you can basically let it play a little video game. So you can create patterns of visual flow, which would be similar to those that the fly perceives when it's flying through the world. And you can also outfit the instrument with devices for measuring the energy that the animal is consuming. And in using these experiments, we really wanted to try to study the long distance flight behavior of the animal, but doing so in a laboratory where we could make very specific measurements. Let me pause and jump forward to the most recent paper that will soon appear from the laboratory, where instead of doing these sorts of experiments inside a lab with a lot of fancy instrumentation, we actually went to the field. We went to the Mojave Desert, and we would release at a given experiment, up to 200,000 flies. And we would use camera systems to detect when they arrived at given positions within the desert. And so we could verify in a real natural environment that these animals were capable of flying for 12 to 15 kilometers without feeding in between. And this is an animal which is about 2.5 millimeters in body length.
Yeah.
So that's an extraordinary dispersal capability for these, little tiny creatures. And it confirmed all of the measurements that we had made years before in the laboratory.
Yeah, so the mechanics of flight in these flies, it's pretty complex, right? There's just the fluid mechanics of this. Could you talk a bit about how exactly do they fly?
Yeah, well, it is a bit complicated. So it doesn't easily translate into the quickest explanation. But basically, the wings of insects operate somewhat like the propellers of helicopters.
Yeah.
They rotate around their base, but instead of a helicopter rotor, which continues to travel in the same direction, at high speed forever, an insect has to flap its wing for about 180 degrees, and then flip the wing over and flap it back. And it basically repeats this sort of, flip, move, flip, move, flip, move, or flip, rotate, flip, rotate, flip, rotate. It repeats that, hundreds of times a second.
Wow, yeah.
And the other thing that it's able to do, which is, very unique compared to aircraft that humans build, is that it sweeps its wing through the air during each one of these repetitions at a very, very high angle of attack. That means that it meets the oncoming air at a very steep angle. And as a consequence, it creates a somewhat exotic flow structure called a leading edge vortex, which you sort of have to visualize as like a little tornado, but oriented horizontally along the edge of the wing, as opposed to vertically, as tornadoes are on the ground. And it's the large amount of circulation that vortex creates that's responsible for the elevated forces that insects are capable of generating with their wings.
Wow, yeah. So it's almost like the vortex pulling it in the direction of flight.
Yeah, well, you can think about the vortex as representing a place where the air pressure is very low. So the wing is effectively sucked upwards and backwards as it's moving, as the insect is sweeping it through the air. And then when it changes direction, it again is creating both lift and drag, but averaged over an entire wing stroke, the predominant force is upwards, and so that's how the animal is able to stably hover in place. And now, if it tilts its body a little bit forward, then that upward force now has a forward component, and the animal can start to cruise around. And for fruit flies, that means going at about a meter per second or so. So it takes a fruit fly about 10 minutes to go a full kilometer.
Right. Yeah. Still really fast. And so hundreds of times per second, the wings flapping back and forth. This is obviously quite programmatic, quite instinctual to the animal. The brain is just doing it instinctually, I would imagine, right?
Yeah, the flies don't have to learn how to fly. Their flies, like most insects, are what we call holometabolous, which means they have a larval form. In case of a butterfly, we have this, very friendly term, caterpillar. In the case of a fly, unfortunately, we have a less friendly term, maggot. But the maggot and caterpillar are really similar life history stages. They're worm-like creatures.
Yeah.
That are responsible for the growth phase of the animal. So the animal goes just like a caterpillar. A fly goes from a very, very, very tiny egg and living mostly on yeast and bacteria that grow on rotting things, like fruit.
Yeah.
The maggots grow to roughly the size of the adult, and then they undergo metamorphosis. And so when they come out of their pupae, which is the little case where the metamorphosis takes place, that's the first time they have wings and legs and look like a fly. And those animals are able to fly the first time they take off. So they don't really have the luxury of being able to learn and practice flying like birds do.
Yeah.
So it's a somewhat miraculous process, really. I mean, I think neuroscientists tend to, and maybe the public as well, tends to think that learning is the most sophisticated thing that nervous systems do. I don't think this is, in my opinion, this is not really correct. Because, I mean, imagine if you took a baby comes right out of the mother's womb, and you put it in the cockpit of an airplane and it could fly. That's basically what's going on in a fly's brain, that the genetic information, which is wiring the brain, is good enough and precise enough that it can encode this remarkably in a sophisticated behavior.
Yeah.
And do so in a very sort of flawless and robust way.
Right. Yeah. The smaller the lifespan of the animal, the more sophisticated, in some sense, the operating system they come with. Right. They, as you say, they don't have the luxury of learning, so they have to come packed with set of apps right from the beginning. So that they don't have to spend much time putting those apps on.
Yeah, I'd say that's right. That's right. I mean, I think that there's lifespan explains a fair bit of it. I mean, there's some other things. If you're not being taken care of by anybody, if you don't have a mother or father, you're somebody's lunch the moment you're born. And so there's a huge selective pressure for flies to be able to function. I mean, even insects that live a long time, I mean, there are insects that live years, and yet, still they have this, capability of being able to fly, the first time they have wings.
Yeah, yeah. And flying is one thing. The other interesting thing is obviously landing and takeoff. I have to say, I used to be an engineer a long time ago, Michael, and every time I see a 747 take off, I just can't just can't peel my eyes off it. It just seems so incredible that we made something like that. But the landing and takeoff here, in the case of the flies, it's an equally incredible thing, isn't it?
Yeah, it certainly is extraordinary. I mean, it's very different than landing and takeoff of a plane. It's obviously a lot faster, and flies are able to reach their cruising speed almost instantly. But some of the real exotic stuff really has to do with the engines, what is powering flight. Because one of the underappreciated secrets of insect flight is not so much that their aerodynamics is so particularly exotic, but it has to do with their muscles. It has to do with the muscles that are capable of flapping the wings in some insects as fast as 1,000 times a second. Now, the flies I work with fly at about 220 times a second, but still, that's remarkably fast. And it really exceeds the speed at which normal muscles, like those in our fingers and extremities, are able to oscillate. So there's been an enormous amount of very exotic cell biology that has evolved within insects, including flies, that have created these muscles that are powerful enough to generate flight, sustain flight, but also can contract and relax at these astonishing rates.
Yeah, those signals, are they electric, Michael, or there are chemicals involved in it too?
Well, actually, it's sort of neither is kind of the answer. The secret to this is that insects have evolved a set of muscles that they use to really power the wings moving back and forth, that don't require a moment by moment input from the animal's brain.
Yeah.
And instead, they're mechanically activated, so that when one muscle contracts, it stretches. Well, say when the downstroke muscle contracts, it stretches the upstroke muscle, and it's that mechanical stretch that molecularly causes the muscle to contract. And so the cycles of relaxation, contraction is all determined by mechanical oscillation. Basically, the nervous system is not, and the cell physiology, normal cell physiology that muscles use, is not fast enough to operate muscles at these speeds. So these muscles have evolved this sort of very exotic mechanism that it's technically we call it a stretch activation. That enables flight. And it's really, I would argue it's really the evolution of this stretch activated muscle that has made the extraordinary radiation of insects in terms of species diversity possible.
They must be quite efficient, right? To go 10 kilometers without refueling at that size. So what's sort of the energy consumption for them?
Let me correct a general misconception.
Yeah.
It's often written that insects are, usually in the context of honeybees, because everybody loves honeybees, that insects are like very efficient flyers. Nothing could be further from the truth. They're terribly inefficient. Compared to a helicopter, which are not particularly efficient compared to airplanes, but even compared to a helicopter, insects are horribly inefficient. And it, so you take animals like honeybees that are these incredible transports for taking nectar and pollen back from the hive to the flowers and so forth. They're consuming an enormous amount of energy. They're basically gas guzzlers.
Yeah.
It's just that the gas happens to be nectar, which is this very rich carbohydrate source. The same is true of hummingbirds, by the way. Hummingbirds are usually, everybody thinks of hummingbirds as being these elegant, efficient animals that sip nectar. They're gas guzzlers, and really what they really are after, especially the females, are insects. They could kind of care less about the nectar, except that it's what they need to put in the gas tank. They need the insects, of course, because without a protein source, the females couldn't make any eggs, and the protein is all coming from the insects that they're eating.
Right. And so the muscles moving back and forth, you say it's not a very efficient mechanism to fly, but these things appear to fly quite long distances, though, right?
Yeah, they can fly long distances, and this is really an interesting point, because there's a fair number of laboratories around the world that are trying to make robotic insects of the same scale as real insects, the size of honeybees. And some of these are like friends and colleagues of mine. But one of they've succeeded in making really impressive little wings that can oscillate back and forth and replicate the back and forth motion that real insect wings generate.
Yeah.
But at the moment, the big failure is they're still currently powered by wires that are hanging down from batteries, that are powering them. The thing that we as engineers haven't succeeded at doing is creating, an engine at that scale that can burn fuel that is as, energy rich as, nectar or sugars and fats,
right.
that insects use. So it's there's no sophisticated, rocket science mathematics that comes out of this. It's just that sugar has a lot of energy, and a full-fed fruit fly has enough energy to be able to flap its wings for, about up to 3 hours.
Yeah.
And in 3 hours, it can cover 15 kilometers.
Right. So what do we know about the evolutionary aspects of this, Michael? Did this evolve sort of separately from other flying mechanisms? I'm talking about insects specifically.
Yeah, we know a lot. We know, there's some things we know in great detail, and then there's some like very embarrassing mysteries. So what we know is that active flight, evolved in animals exactly 4 times. Once in pterosaurs, once in birds, once in bats, and once in insects. So the fossil evidence and the molecular evidence would suggest very strongly that insects are monophyletic, so that the evolution of flight happened only once. And the way it happened in insects is unique among all flying animals, because birds, bats, and pterosaurs all got their wings through transformation of their arms. They fly with modified arms. What happened in insects is really almost fantasy-like. You have to imagine animals like Pegasus, like winged horses, because when wings evolved in insects in the late Silurian or Devonian period, some 400 million years ago, insects were these little scurrying 6-legged creatures. When they evolved the wing, they didn't get rid of any of their legs, and so they maintained their capacity and quite efficient terrestrial walking system. They just slapped a pair of wings on top. So they're a little bit like those, fanciful flying cars that engineers every once in a while try to make.
Yeah.
So that's the story we know very well. The big mystery then is, where did the wings come from? If the wings aren't legs, as they are in birds, bats, and pterosaurs, then they must be like a completely novel structure. And a lot of research has gone into trying to figure out where the wings came from developmentally and evolutionarily.
Are there insects-like animals in the water?
Are there insect-like animals in the water? Well, sort of depends on the way you answer that question. There are a fair number of biologists. I mean, this isn't without controversy, but one of the most prominent practitioners of nervous system evolution, a fellow named Nicholas Strausfeld, has for years been arguing that insects evolved from crustaceans. So if you're familiar with crabs and shrimps and things that we like to eat, he believes and makes some very strong arguments based on the similarity of the nervous system of crustaceans and insects, that insects are closely aligned to crustaceans. So they're basically sort of crustaceans, shrimp-like animals that crawled onto land, and began to fly in sort of a very rough overview. Now there are alternate theories, but insects do share, remarkable affinities with, other arthropods, including crustaceans.
Yeah. I mean, the reason I asked was almost everything that we know on the land came from the water. And I was wondering if there is any analogous things for insects. But we use the term insects sort of lightly, right? I mean, it's a big variety of things, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it's the most species-rich radiation of organisms in the history of the planet. We don't really know how many species there are because we don't have the resources to count them all. But it's the number usually ranges from 3 to 30 million different species of insects, and just flies alone, which are my favorite group of insects, the number that's usually given is 100,000 species, but almost everybody agrees that that is a vast underestimate, because just among people who study insects, there's not nearly as many people who study flies as there are people who study butterflies. I think butterflies are just very popular and they're very pretty. So there's just many undescribed species of flies out there because we're sort of losing our taxonomic experts. Yeah, and this is worth commenting on a little bit because biology has really shifted over the last 50 years or more with the rise of molecular biology and fields of biology that include, classic taxonomy, just being able to describe and recognize different species and evolution. Those specialties have really diminished in numbers compared to areas of biology associated with molecular biology. And of course, it's all very exciting what's going on with gene editing techniques and imaging. And so this is not to say that modern biology is not very exciting, but we've also lost an enormous amount of expertise.
Yeah.
And this is right at a time when the world is recognizing that we are losing insects. We're in the middle of a insect apocalypse, as it's called, where we've lost somewhere between, again, the estimates vary, but around 40 to as high as 75% of the biomass of insects worldwide.
Is it attributable to environmental degradation or something else?
Like all problems of this nature, it's complicated. Certainly one likely source is the use of pesticides. So in temperate places where humans tend to live, the use of neonicotinoids in particular, which are really designed to kill insects, are doing so, but they're doing so in a pretty indiscriminate manner. So that's certainly one problem. Another problem is just environmental degradation. We're losing habitat. There is some evidence that in certain parts of the world, global warming is leading to a loss of insects. So they're really getting hammered from a number of different directions.
Yeah. I want to touch on the other experiments in the paper, Michael. So one of them is looking at this dispersion capabilities, right? Could you talk a bit about that, the experiment you ran around that?
Yeah, so that's a good question because it leads to some of the research that is very current in the laboratory and also within the field of insect sort of neuroscience right now.
Yeah.
I mean, imagine you're an insect and you're released in the middle of nowhere, right?
Yeah.
How would you fly? Where would you go, right? How would you maintain a straight course? This experiment has been done on humans. If you take a human and you release them in a field and what they do is they look around and they see a mountain, they see the sun, they use the sun as a landmark, and they can walk in a straight line.
Yeah.
If you put a burlap sack over their head, they walk in circles. And they don't know they're walking in circles. Like if you take the sack off their head and say, were you walking in a straight line, they'll swear they were walking in a straight line, but they weren't. And it's very much the same with insects. And insects, it turns out, have a very sophisticated navigational system in which they can use the position of the sun.
Yeah.
And they can also use the pattern of polarized light in the sky. So the polarization of light is something that happens to it as it comes through the atmosphere. And, it's why the sky looks a little bit different to us if we're wearing polarized sunglasses versus regular sunglasses. But without something like sunglasses specialized in this way, humans can't detect polarized light, but insects can very well. And if you can read the pattern of polarization in the sky, it's like a map. It's like you can use as a compass. So using either this pattern of polarized light or the sun, the insects effectively have a compass. And there's a region of their brain, a very now sort of sexy region of their brain that everybody's clamoring to study, called the central complex, which is specialized in using this compass information for many, many, many tasks, including being able to navigate. So it's the part of the compass, part of the brain that monarch butterflies use when they're going back and forth between Mexico and Canada. It's the part of the brain that locusts use when they're migrating from one part of Africa to another, and it's a part of the brain that flies use so that they can maintain a stable heading when they're dispersing.
Yeah, so you have another paper related to that. Sun navigation requires compass neurons in Drosophila. And so this is what you mean by using some parts of the brain. But I would imagine in the case of flies, the number of neurons in there are pretty limited, right?
It's a matter of perspective. The number that is thrown around these days as we're getting better evidence from electron microscopy is around 140,000 neurons. So, compared to a human, yes, that's not a large number of cells, but still, you can do some damage with 140,000 neurons, especially, because I believe that insects use each neuron in a sophisticated way. So it's not as if, a neuron is like each neuron is like a transistor. I mean, each neuron is like its own sophisticated computer. Yeah. So when you think about an animal having, 140,000 neurons, the better image is to think of it as having 140,000 little tiny microcomputers all hooked up together. Because some of the computations that an individual neuron can do are rather sophisticated.
Right. So I was just wondering, Michael. So the polarized light, their ability to understand it, use it like a map for navigation, appears to be quite an interesting thing. Humans could utilize, perhaps in, I'm thinking about Mars rovers and things like that. Has there been any sort of attempts at using this?
Well, that's a really good question. So, I mean, the problem, Gil, is that humans evolved GPS. So we kind of figured out a way of cheating, right? By putting up a bunch of satellites, around orbit that are giving us information at a very high level of resolution as to exactly where we are and how we're oriented. So, the interest with availability of GPS of using the sorts of navigational capacities of insects, isn't of great interest as it used to be. But it's a very interesting question. So there's a story that the Vikings used to have stones that they would carry with them when they were on their ocean voyages, and the stones were sort of like clear glass that were basically polarization filters. And so there is this hypothesis that they would use the pattern of polarization in the sky as a compass, because the pattern of polarization in the sky is linked to the position of the sun. Yeah. But there's lots of cases, when the weather is cloudy, the sun is obscured. But the idea is if you just have a patch of blue sky is all you can see, if you can figure out how the light is polarized within that patch of sky, then you can know which direction you're heading. So anyway, so it may have been, I mean, I'm sure there's some debate as to whether the Vikings really used these stones for this purpose, but there at least the possibility exists that ancient human mariners did use exactly the same strategy that insects use.
So that insects cannot navigate at night, or could they use moonlight or something?
Very good question. So, it turns out that the moonlight also gets polarized by the atmosphere.
Yeah.
And there are insects whose eyes are sensitive enough to detect the pattern of polarization in moonlight. Now, again, if the moon is visible, the moon is a much better navigational clue than the pattern of polarization it creates. But on cloudy nights, it's been shown that some insects can actually use the pattern of polarization of moonlight. And it reminds me to make what's a really important point, and you all started this discussion with the title of that paper, Drosophila, Death Valley, and the Devonian Toolkit. And that last term, the Devonian Toolkit, is in the title of the paper because I think there's growing evidence, very, very good evidence, that a lot of these mechanisms we're talking about, using the pattern of polarization in the sky, using this region of the brain called the central complex, these are behavioral modules that evolved a very, very long time ago, at the very origins of insect flight, 400 million years ago. And with the advent of sort of modern anatomical methods, we're really seeing that insect brains, even though the behaviors of the adult insects and the appearance of the adult insects, take a monarch and take a fruit fly and take a dung beetle, for example, are different. The kind of core processor that they're using is very, 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 very similar.
Yeah.
And that's the idea of the Devonian Toolkit, that these algorithms, these behavioral modules, are things that emerged on the planet a long time ago. And what we see in extant animals, so-called crown taxa, are relatively subtle modifications of those very, very ancient behavioral modules.
Yeah. So do we have any evidence, Michael, that flies are getting more robust? They're able to fly for further distances or anything like that? I mean, it's a short period of time, but is there any evidence from history that tells us that things are changing in any way?
Well, that's a whole area of biology, obviously evolutionary biology,
yeah,
that tracks, the changes in the, genes and the appearance of insects through time. And of course, probably one of the most famous examples, textbook examples, has to do with a moth from England,
yeah,
that used to be brightly colored, and then with the Industrial Revolution, as soot started to cover all of the trees got darker and darker and darker and darker, and over 100 years or less, the moths started to get darker and darker and darker and darker in order to match the background.
Yeah.
So that's a classic case of an insect, responding, a population of insects responding evolutionarily to a change in the world that, humans are responsible for.
Yeah, this paper that we talked about, Sun Navigation Requires Compass Neurons, I think it is fairly clearly shown that they are using the sun, right, for the navigation.
Yeah.
You take here, when these cells are silenced, flies no longer adopt and maintain arbitrary headings, but instead exhibit phototaxis. So we have fairly clear evidence that's the case, right?
Well, that was what we found in our paper, that if you sort of break the compass, it's not that the flies fly all cattywampus. It's they revert on a much simpler behavior, which is just flying towards the light. And this is a behavior called phototaxis that even the simplest organisms, even organisms with hundreds of neurons in their brains instead of thousands of neurons in their brains, are capable of a behavior in which they go towards a light or go away from a light. But the ability to maintain a constant orientation relative to a landmark, which is what you need to be able to navigate it. Navigation isn't very helpful if all you can do is fly towards the sun, right? Right.
Yeah.
It's only helpful if you can fly at some sort of chosen arbitrary heading relative to the sun. I mean, what I will say, I mean, just getting away from the sun navigation for a moment, I mean, to ask about, is there evidence that flies are, evolving? The flies that I happen to work on, Drosophila melanogaster, which is sort of the famous research fly that there's, depending upon how you count, 5 Nobel Prizes that have gone to studying these animals. This is why we use the word chromosome, and we understand that genes are arranged on chromosomes. They've been really the model for understanding genetics. since the work of Thomas Hunt Morgan over 100 years ago. Well, these animals have changed. They're different. They're effectively a different species because of their interactions with humans. They used to be a fly. They're from Africa. They lived on the yeast that was grown in a rotting fruit that was common in sub-Saharan Africa. But when humans arrived on the scene and started growing fruit and grains in order to make alcoholic beverages, these animals, evolved to exploit this like much more ready resource of food, and so we're sort of locked in kind of a coevolutionary loop with fruit flies because for example, one trait we share with fruit flies is extremely high alcohol tolerance. Because humans are unique in mammals for evolving the ability to consume alcohol without it being toxic at at the kind of levels that we enjoy in our beverages. It's the same for flies. Flies can tolerate much higher levels of alcohol than can most other insects.
And sugar. So sugar might be another thing that we have in common.
Yeah, well, I think we well, unfortunately, lots of animals I mean, you sort of can't beat sugar as a carbohydrate source. So it's
we'll take a quick break, Michael. When we come back, we'll talk about your other paper on the aerodynamics and control of flight.
This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.
So, Michael, we are back. We are talking about insects, flies, how they fly, the sort of the complexity of their mechanics of flight, as well as how dispersed they could be, and how they navigate to get to that dispersion. You have another paper entitled "The Aerodynamics and Control of Free Flight Maneuvers in Drosophila." You say a firm understanding of how fruit flies hover has emerged over the past 2 decades, and recent work has focused on the aerodynamic, biomechanical, and neurobiological mechanisms that enable them to maneuver and resist perturbations. This is a fascinating thing, Michael. You mentioned they are sort of creating a vortex in front of them by very rapidly moving their wings, and that vortex is sort of sucking them in the forward flight. But there is more to it, right? Movement is one thing, but you have to be able to control that movement. Because you also have predators in the neighborhood, so you have to be able to take turns quite fast also, I would imagine.
Yeah, that's right. So there's many researchers, myself included, for many years, for the better part of half a century, had our nose to the grindstone to understand, this basic problem of how an insect generates enough lift to stay in the air. And that led to the discovery of this leading edge vortex and this basic pattern of flapping motion that could explain, why the fly is in the air and not crashing into the ground, or why any insect but once you understand that, that's just sort of the tip of the iceberg, because insects do such exotic things once they're in the air. Flies in particular are capable of very exotic chasing behavior and predator avoidance behavior. And so I'd say the interest in the field sort of switched to understanding how flies are able to manipulate these aerodynamic forces such that they can execute these maneuvers. And that's been and still is a very active part of the research within the laboratory. And one of the things that makes it so both interesting and difficult is that just the way the physics work, it turns out that if an insect moves its wing just a little bit differently, on the left side of the body versus the right side of the body, or in one stroke relative to the next stroke, that has enormous consequences for the forces that are created. So it's not the case, like your image of an insect that performs this super rapid maneuver, the image should not be that it like stops flapping one wing, right? And starts making these, really large changes in the way it flaps the other wing. That's not at all what's going on. It's just the subtlest of alterations of what one wing is doing relative to what another wing is doing is enough to produce very, very, very large changes in forces and moments that the animal can use to execute complete changes in direction, change its course by 180 degrees in less than a human eye blink. And one of the challenges for us then is to understand how is an animal that has so few muscles controlling its wings, relatively few neurons in its brain, how can it control its wings so precisely to execute the tiniest of changes in wing motion that it needs to do in order to both fly straight and maneuver. And so that's probably the most sort of active area of research right now in the laboratory is really understanding how the brain can control the wing motion in such a subtle way. It has the most sensitive little knobs that it has to regulate in order to fly.
Yeah, this chasing behavior and the predator avoidance behavior you talked about, these are conscious decisions. And so going back to our discussion from before, they come with out of the box a very sophisticated operating system that is able to do a lot of things. But these types of behaviors are conscious decisions. And so interplay between that conscious decisions and that instinctual capabilities to change things, that is, I would imagine, is a rich area to study.
Yeah, I mean, I would be a little careful if I say they were conscious decisions. I certainly agree that they're decisions.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things that an animal will do when it detects a predator nearby. For example, the animal might freeze. It might halt its motion. It might raise its wings, getting ready to take off and do an evasive maneuver, but not pull the trigger yet. Yeah. It might get its legs ready to push off without taking further action, or it might execute a rapid takeoff. So the animal does have options, and in different circumstances, it chooses different decisions. So I think decision making is certainly appropriate rhetoric. And one of my former students, a woman named Gwyneth Card, has really spent most of her career studying the neural circuitry underlying all these various decisions. But I still think that's a little bit, one doesn't necessarily have to invoke consciousness.
Sure. Yeah.
Because it could all still be like you could build a very, very, very clever robot that made such decisions.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know much about this, Michael, but I would think it's more like templates. So just like people might be building robots that they come with a set of templates, and you can pick template 5 in a situation, and that template has all the sort of the instructions encoded in it. So once you pick that template, then everything else sort of falls in place. Maybe something along those lines.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a reasonably good heuristic model as to like what's going on in the fly's brain. And the thing that's very exciting right now, because of advances in the genetic tools that are available, it's possible to actually kind of get an answer to understanding what those templates are. So I'd say for the past 20 years, we've mostly been studying what you're calling, I think appropriately, templates.
Yeah.
Using behavioral methods. We can use high-speed video cameras. We can perform behavioral psychophysics to quantify and characterize all of the various possible actions that flies can take. What's becoming possible now, or algorithms, sometimes people use the term algorithms to describe these, but I think it's similar to your use of template.
Yeah.
Now, because of the fancy genetic techniques, it's getting possible to look and see how the brain, how individual neurons, and circuits of neurons are actually implementing those algorithms. And that's what's drawing a lot of interest into the field right now, because one can go from there's just like there's many ways you could code in a computer, sort of basically the same algorithm. There's lots and lots of different ways that the brain might be solving these problems. But now we have the tools available that make it possible to really understand how the brain is implementing these these different behaviors.
Can we image their brains in flight? Do we have any technology to do that?
Yes, we can. I mean, we can't image from the brains of a freely flying animal, but we can image from the brain of a fly that's flying in a little flight simulator. So we do this quite routinely in the laboratory, where we kind of attach the fly's head to a little sort of stage that is hooked up to a special microscope. And in that fly, certain neurons are expressing proteins that will change their fluorescent properties when they're active. So while the fly is flying and playing a little video game that, or being subjected to some sort of sensory stimulus, you can image the activity of from specific neurons within the fly's brain. And you can do the opposite. You can also use techniques using agents called optogenetic proteins.
Yeah.
So these are proteins that you can express in a cell so that when you shine a light on that cell, the cell becomes active. So you can effectively remotely control neurons within the brain and then ask if the fly changes its behavior in response to those manipulations. You can use genetic tools to silence neurons so that they aren't active. So you can turn on, turn off, and image specific neurons within the brain. So that combination of techniques is really, leading to kind of a revolution in our ability to understand how these tiny brains work.
The great model at 100,000 neurons, technology might be getting closer to that level of sophistication in silicon. And if we have, sort of a sufficient understanding of how things are firing in there might be quite interesting applications.
Yes, I think it's true. And the final leg of the table that I didn't describe is the fact that a fly's brain is small enough that it is possible to make a single serial block for electron microscopy, and using the most sophisticated machine learning algorithms. There are groups around the world that are coming up with a complete connectome, so the wiring diagram of the entire fly brain, so that you can tell where every cell that contacts or is contacted by every other cell. And in concert with this growing knowledge, there's a lot of interest in using computational methods to basically model how these networks of neurons are operating to perform the tasks that they're performing. So I think that if there is a time when we're going to be able to learn something useful about how flies or other similarly organized creatures perform computations using these very dense microbrains, it's going to be over the next 5 or 10 years. Like the technology is becoming available now. So it's a pretty exciting time.
What's your instinct, Michael? There's obviously differing opinions around this. The computer science, robotics areas are on a path of throwing more silicon at the problem, create bigger and bigger deep learning neural networks to solve problems that they see. But there is also a view that we are on a wrong path. The brain of an animal doesn't work like that at all. It's not a deep learning neural network. It is something completely different. Do you have a view on this?
Yeah, I do. I have a pretty strong view. I mean, at least for the nervous systems of insects, but I suspect for the nervous systems of even larger organisms like mice, monkeys, and possibly even humans. I do not think that the deep neural network model is going to end up being particularly informative in understanding how insect brains work. I think the insect brains are making the computations in a very, very different way. Now, don't get me wrong. I am not by any means trashing machine learning. We use it in the laboratory routinely as a powerful tool. So I see it as a transformative, engineering application, but I don't think it. My opinion is that it will end up not being a very good model for how the brains and the natural world actually function.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you, Michael. One symptom of this is that the brain doesn't require tons and tons of data to get to reasonable decisions. It's able to do it very, very quickly with very little data.
Yes.
And the amount of the bits of information that is communicated between the neurons, it's a few bits. It's not high bandwidth, tons of data going back and forth either. So I think from a design perspective, I think we are still missing how the brain is really constructed.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I mentioned this before, this idea that a fly undergoes metamorphosis, comes out of its little pupal case and can, instantly fly. I tell this to people when I'm giving lectures, and often engineers in the audience, they just patently won't believe me. They just say that can't be, that you're missing something, like that it must be that the fly learns to fly, that there's a training set somehow, that maybe the fly is practicing while it's still in the pupal case or something. I mean, it's just, but I agree with you that the for this reason, that I just, the animals don't have the, as I said, the same rhetoric before, the animals just don't have the luxury,
Yeah.
to learn how to do all this stuff. It has to be hardwired. It has to be baked into the nervous system from the get-go.
Yeah, I want to touch on one other thing, Michael. So the leading edge vortex that you talked about, sort of the fluid mechanics around that propels the fly. We don't have any human created mechanism like that, right, today?
Not really. There is a phenomenology that you find on certain types of windmills, where there is an attached vortex. So to get a leading edge vortex, you need to have something that rotates, that kind of rotates about a center, for sort of a technical reason. But it really boils down to this, Gil. If you wanted to build something that flew like an insect, right? What you would do is you would have a wing that operated at a much lower angle of attack, and spin it very, 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 very fast. And the insect wings at low angles of attack are much more efficient. So, the basic efficiency of any wing is most simply summarized by something called the lift to drag ratio, the amount of lift it creates per unit drag it creates. And insect wings, the way insects use them, are terribly inefficient. It's just that the insects, because of the limitations of muscles, the insects can't flap their wing fast enough to generate enough force at a low angle of attack. And so, as a compromise, they use these very high angles of attack that generate these very high lift coefficients, but they also generate enormous drag, and they pay for that drag dearly. So, from an engineering perspective, you'd be an idiot to try to build a quad rotor using a leading edge vortex, because it would be much more efficient to just use a low angle of attack wing and spin the wing faster.
Is there a trade-off, Michael, between, I don't know anything about this, but is there a trade-off between that efficiency in propulsion to maneuverability in any way? I'm just wondering why nature ended up with this design for flies.
Yeah, a lot of people speculate a lot on that. I mean, one thing to remember, though, is that nature abhors wheels. There's only one true wheel in nature, and it's in the tail of a bacterium. You can't sort of have like an axle and bearings and something that spins continuously. It's not compatible with circulatory systems and digestive systems and all the connections. So an insect is sort of stuck with a wing that can only flap for 100 or 180 degrees before it has to flip over and flap in the opposite direction. It's just physically impossible to make something that can spin continuously.
Right.
That said,
Yeah.
it's also true what I said before, that when you have two wings, and those two wings are, instead of one wing that's spinning around like a helicopter, when you have two wings, and those two wings can move in subtly different ways, that gives you enormous aerodynamic purchase on maneuverability.
Yeah.
In a way that a conventional helicopter doesn't have.
Right. Do you see engineering designs emanating from a closer understanding of the flight here?
I think that the problem is in fabrication. I mean, the problem that the people like Rob Wood at Harvard and others who've tried to make flying devices the size of insects is, making that microstructure that can move the wing in this like very precise way. And this is at a size domain, a scale where gears, bearings, belts, stepper motors, like those things don't work. They're too big. They're too susceptible to friction. Everything has to be done with flexure. Everything has to be done with effectively, like, molecular origami. And I'd say that we as engineers just don't have the fabrication capabilities to be able to make structures so sophisticated at that size range. I mean, a lot of people are trying to make inroads in this direction, but throughout human history, humans do big really well. Like we got pyramids down, right? We got the Eiffel Tower. I mean, beautiful, right? Where we struggle is with small.
Right.
And I think that even though there's been some advances in that domain, we still struggle with small.
Yeah. And the other innovation that needs to go in tandem here is material sciences, right? So we might still be missing sort of big material science changes. I mean, if you find materials that have different properties than we currently have, that essentially change the engineering fabrication equation.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a great point. But they're linked, because if you really get into, and I mean, I could give 5 podcasts just on the insect wing hinge itself. I mean, I think it's the most sophisticated mechanical structure in the animal kingdom. But when you get into it, it not only has this complicated morphology, but the material properties vary, at this almost molecular scale. So, it's not like you take a substance and you sort of fold it into something. You take the substance that's made of many substances and with all different types of elastic properties and stiffnesses and viscosities and strengths and toughness, and you make a wing hinge out of that. And how to sort of build, we struggle just to make a cool new material, right?
Right.
How do we make like a something? I mean, even calling it a composite doesn't really, give it justice.
Yeah. It is composites, but it is a combination of material science and engineering design, and it sounds sort of iterative, Michael. So nature spent 400 million. I don't know. I don't know how long. To try to get to this design. So it's not going to be easy, that's for sure.
No.
So I know that you are still doing a lot of work in this area. So we look forward 5 years, Michael. Where do you see we would make more discoveries and perhaps even some bridging to practical applications from here?
Well, I think it really is going to be, the most of the needle is going to move in the domain of neuroscience, because of the emergence of these connectomes, where we know the full circuit diagram of the nervous system. That's sort of a real game changer. I don't think our knowledge of the aerodynamics per se is going to change that much. I think these problems with understanding the microstructure of the wing hinge is just, it's a very hard problem. But where I do think we're going to make a lot of progress is understanding how the brain works and how information is processed as the animal flies.
Right. And so in some sense, it is coming together. So there's a whole area of using nature's designs to robotics, right? So that appears to be really taking off now.
Yes, that's it. Yes.
But
I mean,
would you say we are behind in sort of the neuro biological mechanisms, understanding how the brain actually does it, or
I'll stick to what I said before, Gil. I really think that a lot of it has to do with like fabrication. Like, we can build a decent robo-tuna, right?
Yeah.
We can build a decent robo-dog and goat, right?
Yeah.
But these are things where conventional engineering tools, from rack and pinions to encoders and servo motors and pulleys and belts and all that stuff works, but we just don't do small well, right? I mean, so the challenge of making a robo tuna or the very engaging stuff that Boston Dynamics builds, but to do that at the scale of an insect, I think is it's an order of magnitude more challenging task.
Yeah, I almost see a different discipline, Michael. Yeah, it's not engineering as we think of engineering. It's something slightly different. On the other hand, since it's an engineering-like problem, it is ultimately a solvable problem, not like a biological problem that we may never get an answer for, right? The engineering problems should be solvable over time.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, one hopes.
This has been great, Michael. Thanks so much for spending time with me.
Well, thank you. It's been an enjoyable conversation.
Thanks so much.
Okay, bye-bye.
This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.